Good evening. My goodness, this is absolutely wonderful to see so many people in this room. My name's Tom Herman. I'm the Vice President Academic, and it's my pleasure and honor this evening to moderate this conversation. First, before we begin, I would ask any of you who have flexible knees and would like to sit in the front here, please feel free to come down. You may wish to do that rather than stand. My apologies for the shortage of chairs. But please do come down if you're willing to sit cross-legged. There's lots of room up front, and hopefully the fire marshal is not here. For those who might have been apprehensive earlier today that this evening's conversation might draw a small crowd, I think that those fears have been sufficiently allayed. And I think it reminds us of just how topical and important this subject is. We live in an increasingly secular world, at least on our part of the planet, and a world in which science in many ways has become the new religion. But in fact, these very basic and long-standing questions about theism have been around a long time and are going to be with us, I think, for a very long time. So I'm looking forward this evening to a spirited discussion around this topic, and the question that's being addressed is why worry about a godless world? First of all, I'd like to introduce the two speakers for this evening, and then I will just say a few words about how we're going to operate in terms of logistics. So our first speaker this evening is Dr. Anna Robbins, and Anna is an associate professor of theology, culture, and ethics, and the director of doctoral studies, as well as the academic dean at the Acadia Divinity College. Anna's no stranger to Acadia. She actually did a few degrees here, but she did her first degree as a Bachelor of Arts at Carleton, and then came to Acadia, where she did a Master of Religious Education in 1993 and a Master of Arts in Theology in 1997. After that, she went on to the UK and did her doctoral degree at Aberystwyth in Wales. And then between 2000 and 2002, she served on the faculty of the London School of Theology and teaching a variety of subjects. Anna's been involved in many organizations and activities over the years, including a public theology, rather interesting public theology think tank called Theos, and has returned to her roots in Wolfville in 2012 to take on her present position. So we're delighted to have her here this evening. Our second speaker this evening is Dr. Paul Abela. Paul is also no stranger to Acadia, although he holds no degrees from here. However, we won't hold that against him. He does have a degree or two from universities with which you might be familiar. He holds a BA from the University of Toronto, an MA from Queen's, and a Doctor of Philosophy from a fairly well-known university in the UK called Oxford. And Paul has been here since 2001, teaching in the Department of Philosophy, and he is presently an associate professor in that department with interests in a variety of subjects, quite Catholic tastes, and including the philosophy of Kant, environmental philosophy, and socio-political philosophy. His research interests include Kantian moral theory, issues in environmentalism, and philosophical concerns stemming from the post-2008 financial bailout. So, I'd be interested to hear how his thoughts have changed recently. So, those are our two speakers. The activity this evening is going to involve a 30-minute presentation by each, although Anna's already bargaining for additional time because she told me since she's speaking first, she has to lay the groundwork, and that's going to cut into her time. So I may have to get out the hook. And then Paul will speak for 30 minutes, and then each will have a rebuttal of approximately 5 to 7 minutes, at which point we will open the conversation to all of you. As my job is basically to moderate, to maintain decorum and civility in the room, hopefully deflect any projectiles from our speakers. And the only other thing I would say about the protocol is that since this is not the CBC debaters, there will be no bare knuckle round. Without further ado, I'm turning the podium over to Dr. Robbins.
Yes? Haha. It's terrific to have such a full room for our discussion tonight. And yes, I did negotiate for just a few extra minutes because I do have to lay some of the groundwork as your first speaker tonight. I'll try not to take too much extra time. And as my students know, there's no way I would ever go over time, chasing any tangents whatsoever, impossible. You're entering really into a conversation that is already underway. So what we're going to talk about tonight is not the first that we've talked about it. Essentially, Paul made contact with me some time ago, and we had what I found to be a very stimulating conversation over coffee at Just Us. It turned from a short conversation into a very long conversation. I had the opportunity to read some of the things that he had written on the topics that we're addressing tonight, and I found also that they were very stimulating and engaging. And we began a bit of an exchange on that. And I think it wasn't long before we realized that the things we were talking about might be of interest to a lot more people than just us too. And so we thought that it would be a good idea to open this up into a public forum, which is why you're all here tonight. So you're entering this conversation already begun. And I use that really as my excuse because occasionally I will be referring to things that Paul says and so on, but he hasn't actually said them yet. And he might actually not say them to you at all. And he might actually say to you that he was never intending to say such things whatsoever. So I'm apologizing to you in advance if I put things into your mouth or your pen or your computer that were never meant to be there. I will try to keep my references to what you say limited. But just so that you know the context of our conversation, it's a friendly one. And it's one that we're inviting you now to participate in. We don't anticipate any blood on the floor tonight, so yes, no bare knuckle round, and we hope it will be a conversation within an atmosphere of mutual respect. Well, I was living in England about 5 years ago when the bus campaign started. I was walking down the road when a red London bus passed me with the sign that read, "There probably is no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." Now, remember, you can see almost anything on a London bus. So on the one hand, I was not surprised. But what I did notice was that those pesky atheists were getting a bit more proactive in spreading their gospel than perhaps they had been before. Upon later investigation, it turned out that the atheists in question, Richard Dawkins and his cronies, were irritated by the bus adverts for the Alpha Course, a Christian introduction that, although running for years, had recently had some high-profile converts from the celebrity world and the media. And so they were annoyed by these bus ads that encouraged them to consider that there might be more to life than sitting on an urban bus, in London traffic, day in and day out. Forget it, they wanted to say. Stop worrying. Enjoy your life. Well, therein lies the very heart of the problem. Most people have enough challenge and trouble in their lives that to encourage them to stop worrying is the atheistic equivalent of telling them to forget about their problems because Jesus will take care of it all. Both are simplistic responses to complex human problems. The basic questions of human existence persist and rise. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? What is the point of life? Indeed, some evidence suggested that the bus campaign produced the unanticipated response of increasing enrollment in Alpha, as people were encouraged to wonder what it would really mean to stop worrying and enjoy life. Not only that, but it is hard to enjoy your life when you are a theist dealing with the new atheism. I know they're scary pictures. I was told this before. It's a bit unfair, but only a bit. You will know the new atheists to be a group of people who have become quite militant in their atheism. This is one of the qualities of new atheism, is that it's very evangelistic in its atheistic fervor. Not only that, but they paint a very stark picture of religion and religion's influence in society, and a very bright picture for the future if everyone embraced atheism. I'll give you a sense of feeling if you've not read any of these new atheists. I won't quote Dawkins at this point because he kind of becomes the horseman of the apocalypse in type, as it were. Christopher Hitchens, who is no longer with us, wrote the book, God is Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. It became a #1 international bestseller. They've all written in #1 international bestsellers, so of huge influence. And he writes this: the person who is certain and who claims divine warrant for his certainty belongs now to the infancy of our species. It may be a long farewell, but it has begun, and like all farewells, should not be protracted. Sam Harris, who wrote The End of Faith, The Moral Landscape, Letter to Christian America. I hope to show that the very ideal of religious tolerance, born of the notion that every human being should be free to believe whatever he wants about God, is one of the principal forces driving us towards the abyss. Very emotive language. What is the abyss for an atheist anyway? I'd love to know that. Very theological concept. Dan Dennett, Breaking the Spell, Religion as Natural Phenomenon. You can see how it's getting a bit evangelistic in its fervor now. Like the revivalist preacher, I say unto you, O religious folks, who fear to break with the taboo, let go, let go. You'll hardly notice the drop. There's not a lot here that brings me joy. But fair enough, that is not their job. You can imagine that I was encouraged then in my conversations with Paul to know that he too, even as an atheist, wasn't convinced that we should so readily cast our worries about the human predicament and our future aside with such abandon. We had some good conversation about it, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading the articles that he wrote about it. I hope that you've get them published, have them published, on the way to being published. They are really quite excellent. And it wasn't only because he was wearing this t-shirt that we decided to open this discussion on some of the issues from two divergent perspectives. He wasn't really, of course. And it's my hope that this experience tonight extends rather than inhibits our new friendship, and perhaps will open up the conversation for others to have with others of even further differing perspectives. And so the uncomfortable atheist and the uncomfortable theist meet. The matter of why I am a theist is too big for this time together, though some of it will peek out here and there as we go on. But why am I an uncomfortable theist? I am uncomfortable for two sets of reasons. First, I am uncomfortable because I've returned to Canada after 15 years in Europe to find that Christianity has not only been pushed to the margins, it has been thus to a greater and lesser degree, at least for my lifetime, but it has been marginalized from public life to the point that those who hold religious views are often and quickly ridiculed and summarily dismissed as ignorant rednecks. No doubt there are many ignorant rednecks who are also Christians. So there are ignorant fundamentalist atheists. It would be unfair to declare all to be so. Christians are told there is no place for their belief in the public square, as though any of us can remove our worldview lenses at will. As though we can pretend that the Fathers of Confederation were not moved by their Christian convictions to see Canada united as a dominion from sea to shining sea. Christians have overreacted in their insecurity, which I suppose is a typical Canadian response. If I am sorry for everything, then I need to be sorry, especially for believing in God. It can get quite uncomfortable, as this MP from Manitoba demonstrates when he was asked to bring Christmas greetings to someone with a camera in the hallway. Here we go.
I want to wish everyone a really Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, all the holiday, all you infidel atheists out there. I want to wish you the very best also. I don't know what you celebrate during the holiday season. I myself celebrate the birth of Christ. It's your choice, and I respect your choice. If you wish to celebrate nothing and just get together with friends, that's good.
You see how ridiculous it's become? He can't even stand up with any degree of confidence and just say, well, I happen to be a Christian, so Merry Christmas to those of you for whom that means anything. Instead, we have to get this whole convoluted of, well, whatever it is, and I'm not going to offend you. It's a very Canadian kind of stance, isn't it, at the end of the day? So I am uncomfortable, really, that it has come to this. I am uncomfortable that it has come to this, and that Christians are to blame for this state of affairs as much as anyone. By not communicating clearly the most positive aspects of our faith, we are known for what we are against rather than what we are for, and have often withdrawn from dialogue in the public sphere. So I am not merely pointing a finger here unless it comes back to me as well. I am also uncomfortable as a theist with those elements of belief that are hard to explain or reconcile with other elements of my worldview. I am uncomfortable dealing with biblical violence because I am shaped by a culture that does not readily understand it. I am uncomfortable because I find I am surrounded by bedfellows of a kind that make me wish I could sleep alone, and I'm sure they think the same about me too from time to time. I am uncomfortable considering the Plato-old question of reconciling the goodness of God with the scale of suffering in the world. I am uncomfortable because no matter how coherent I want my Christian worldview to be, it is sometimes less than fully so. Nevertheless, this is the case for all worldviews, including the naturalist one, and I still think that a Christian worldview has the potential to offer the most coherent explanation for why things are the way they are, for why we encounter the world the way we do, for why we worry. We worry. Perhaps the most because we know there is so much of life that is out of our control. And yet, the bits that do lie within our control, we tend to completely mess up. Reinhold Niebuhr, following Kierkegaard, showed the inadequacy of the main philosophical views of humanity and revealed the strength of a Christian view, particularly in understanding the tension or anxiety that humans experience as those who are inseparably enslaved to their biological limits, subject to nature, needful of it for survival, and yet who have this remarkable ability to transcend the limits of our biology and to imagine ourselves as much more. Accordingly, humans have always been their own most vexing problem. We are evidently more than animals and evidently less than gods. This is why we worry. And a life that we can appreciate is too short. We worry we are not doing enough. We worry we are doing too much. We worry we are capable of more. We worry that we will only be able to do a little. Or we stop worrying and withdraw, retreating into our biology and denying our transcendent selves. What happens when we deny one side of this tension or the other is tragic. It is what Christians have traditionally called sin. Popular word. Francis Spufford, in his book, Unapologetic, helps us to realize that this word sin has been reduced to a naughty indulgence in our contemporary culture, like eating chocolate or having sex. What we're talking about, though, is really much deeper. It's the human propensity to screw things up, and to screw them up royally. It is this doctrine that Niebuhr referred to as the only scientifically verifiable doctrine of the Christian faith. After all, according to the Pew Research Religion and Public Life Project, there are more than 2.18 billion Christians of all ages around the world, representing nearly a third of the estimated 2010 global population of 6.9 million. This, of course, doesn't count the many adherents of other religions, theistic and otherwise, who occupy the world. The last Canadian census revealed an atheist percentage of around 16%, still far from the majority, though Reginald Bibby's research has suggested that the most significant increase in non-believers is among younger Canadians. Those of you here tonight will have to attest to that or not. So we might expect this figure to rise. Informal numbers discussed range as high as 30% of Canadians who may identify themselves as atheist. While numbers of atheists seem stable in the United States at around 10%, again, there's a significant increase in atheism amongst young people. It is clear then that when we talk about a godless world, although we're not talking about Christianity disappearing from the face of the earth, we are talking about a very significant phenomenon. Here from the Pew Foundation, again, their comprehensive demographic study of more than 200 countries. This is what they write. In 1910, about 2/3 of the world's Christians lived in Europe, where the bulk of Christians had been for a millennium, according to historical estimates by the Center for the Study of Global Christianity. Today, only about 1/4 of all Christians live in Europe. A plurality, more than 1/3 are now in the Americas, about 1 in every 4 lives in sub-Saharan Africa, and about 1 in 8 is found in Asia and the Pacific. So the number of Christians around the world has nearly quadrupled in the last 100 years, from about 600 million in 1910 to more than 2 billion in 2010. But the world's overall population has also risen rapidly, and the percentage of Christians in the world's population today is about the same as it was before. This apparent stability, however, masks a momentous shift, and this is what we're talking about tonight. Although Europe and the Americas are still home to a majority of the world's Christians, 63%, that share is much lower than it was in 1910, where it stood at 93%. And the proportion of Europeans and Americans who are Christian has dropped from 95% in 1910 to 76% in 2010 in Europe as a whole, and from 96 to 86% in the Americas as a whole. So what we are facing really is the decline of the Christian underpinnings of our cultural institutions in the Western world, and Western decline in faith itself. Is this worrying? Some think it is not. They prefer to think of it as liberating. And there are no doubt some aspects of Christian influence that have proved less than edifying over the centuries. However, there are other aspects of this influence that have so permeated our identity that we will notice the drop. They have so permeated our identity that when we let go, we will certainly notice the drop. And we may find somewhere in there that we have lost something of ourselves. There are values that have driven the social agenda, including freedom, equality, human dignity. They underpin human rights. It's helped to develop stability in our society. It has allowed human beings to flourish and to seek to extend justice to the poor and the marginalized around the world. Though even these values can find themselves corrupted, to lose the best of the very foundation of our society is worrying. Christian virtue reins in the excesses of the transcendent self by reminding us that we are accountable to one more transcendent still, whose judgment of our selfishness leads us to strive for ever better forms of justice, ever deeper love. Christian virtue acknowledges and extends the bond to nature. It offers wisdom, models a cycle of self-sacrifice and resurrection that gives hope to the world. Christianity has been intrinsic to the development of Western civilization, and although there have been civilizations other than Christian ones that have flourished in the history of the world, I am not overly keen to take our chances on what might follow ours. There are certainly less amenable gods, including consumerism, who wait in the wings, more than eager to fill the gap left by a rejection of theistic values. The new atheists herald a day when religious ideas will not only be unpopular but untolerated. And I find this disturbing. It is disturbing that tolerance has become redefined. The old tolerance said that we need to have a public space where we put up with each other, even when we differ. The new tolerance says we need to have a space where we meet each other, but only if you're going to agree with me. I find that disturbing if we can't have discussions about things we disagree. The new atheists, especially here Sam Harris, insist that we must find our way to a time when faith without evidence disgraces everyone who would claim it. Disgraces everyone who would claim it. That's a powerful word of social judgment and exclusion. But the future looms even more sinister when he suggests that the link between belief and behavior is considered. He writes this: the link between belief and behavior raises the stakes considerably. Some propositions are so dangerous that it may be ethical to kill people for believing them. This may seem like an extraordinary claim, he writes, but it merely enunciates an ordinary fact about the world in which we live. It certainly is an extraordinary claim. A tolerant society is dead in the water when a supposedly rational person advocates potential murderous thought police and the book becomes an international bestseller. Do you see? The same tendency for human beings to screw things up that affects Christians affects new atheists too. But where did they get their ideas that something is good or just or isn't just how it should be? Following Dalrymple's observations, being religious is not synonymous with being good. But without God, we have nothing to strive for. Belief is not only higher than oneself, but higher than all of us. We jettison God with one hand, and we realize we can't do without him on the other. God doesn't exist. The bastard reckons the character in Samuel Beckett's Endgame. New atheists highlight the excesses and abuses of Christianity over the centuries, and no doubt they have many to choose from. We have no right to be anything other than shamed by these. But just as it would be unfair to tar all naturalists with the same brush, so it is to do that to Christians, or indeed all people of faith. Dawkins admits he became militant in his atheism because of the religious fervor that drove the atrocities of 9/11. To then target non-extremist theists with his scorn seems a bit misplaced. There are many, many examples of how belief and behavior have worked to perform some true wonders in our civilization, from science to art to social emancipation. It was the belief in God that was the belief that God created the world with a sense of order that led to Western scientific discovery. It was commitment to reason as thinking God's thoughts after him that led to the development of Western universities. It's a belief in the beauty of things that gives birth to music and to art. Studying the genome led Francis Collins to such paths of wonder that he became a Christian. We are not all ignorant rednecks. You have permission to believe. I want my son to grow up in a world where he has permission to believe or not. And so, as you can see, I am worried about a few things. And there are some things that do not worry me. As a human being and a mother and one who likes stability and, let's face it, the comforts of life, I am worried that they could be undermined. As a Christian, though, I am not worried. I am not interested in having my faith realized in the organs of society. I am a Baptist after all. I will protect my voice in the public square, and I will fight for religious freedom for all people. We cannot expect for ourselves what is not offered for everyone. But where religious freedom is denied and the church is pushed to the margins, there we thrive. There we thrive. It is not comfortable. It is not easy. But the margins are where the church experiences the power of faith. The very story of our own university emerges from a church at the margins. When people of few resources but deep commitment to God sacrificed and saved and worked and demonstrated the power of what Christian belief can do to include and forgive, to lay foundations for a future, to motivate towards education and a better future for all. And without them, at least some of us here wouldn't have a job, at least not the ones that we have at the moment. I think there is compelling evidence from the best of Christianity to commit to a Christian way of life simply because it bears the potential to yield enormously positive outcomes. And it's capable of uniting communities and generating the kind of enthusiasm that can actually get things done. The argument from utility, though compelling, is insufficient. Paul and I agree on this, I think. Truth does matter. Truth matters. On this point, truth matters. And it needn't be edifying. Truth is sometimes liberating and sometimes condemning. But on the matter of what is true, here we part company. So is it only reason then that leads to truth? An honest and uncomfortable theist acknowledges that for all their value, and they are far more valuable than the careless way they are treated by Dawkins in the God Delusion, the theistic proofs may open up some interesting discussions about God, but they do not provide sufficient reason to lead most people to belief in God. You see, you cannot reason your way to God. Herein lies the problem. He is the one who speaks to us more than we speak to him. Slowly, softly, sometimes he speaks in a whisper, not with weapons or armies, but he does want to be known. You can't prove his existence by reason. But let me say this, that is not to say that finding ourselves in the existential predicament of belief is thereby unreasonable. Not being established by reason is not the same as saying it is without philosophical warrant. The atheist bus campaign was honest enough to admit there is probably no God. It's a basic assumption. But I find that there probably is a God. And this too is a basic assumption. I find that there probably is a God, and though many evidentialists, particularly foundationalists, would suggest that believing God is intellectually irresponsible, others would indicate that there's sufficient evidence to warrant belief. Still others would posit that belief in God, such as Platinga, is properly basic. And the confession of belief in God is a matter of a first-order statement linguistically and therefore beyond the scope of rational inquiry. The job of reason for the theologian, then, ranges along the spectrum to seek evidence, coherence, understanding, explanation. The explanatory power of Christianity is one area of great rational strength. As C.S. Lewis confessed, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. We cannot reason our way to God, but neither do we reason our way to the existential experience of joy or love or beauty or despair. A Christian worldview makes very good sense of these things, acknowledges both the great dignity of the human being and her limits, knows she will screw up, but offers a place of forgiveness and renewal, implants purpose and hope and meaning, and offers a moral compass. These are not unreasonable. They rest on the truth. But the truth for a Christian is not a proposition, but a person. Many atheists explore the evidence for the life, not many atheists explore the evidence for the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, I'm sure as Dr. Evans will attest. And for the documents that record the event, though they are compelling, they remain unexplored and unconsidered. On the basis of his discussions of the existence of tacit knowledge, Michael Polanyi demonstrates that science and God need not be at odds. We need to acknowledge, in the words of theologian and scientist John Polkinghorne, that reality is a multi-layered unity. I can perceive another person as an aggregation of atoms, he writes, an open biochemical system in interaction with the environment, a specimen of Homo sapiens, an object of beauty, someone whose needs deserve my respect and compassion, a brother or sister for whom Christ has died. All are true and all mysteriously cohere in one person. To deny one of these levels is to diminish both that person and myself, the perceiver, to do less than justice to the richness of reality. Part of the case for theism, he writes, is that in God, the Creator, the ground of all that is, these different levels find their lodging and their guarantee. He is the source of connection, the one whose creative act holds in one the worldviews of science, aesthetics, ethics, and religion. as expressions of his reason, joy, will, and presence. Perceiving the multi-layered reality of human existence led one-time atheist A.N. Wilson back to theism. He was a fully paid-up member of the New Atheist Club, having written books undermining Christian understandings of Jesus and St. Paul. When he came to recognize and experience, really, the lack of the explanatory power of naturalism, it could not satisfy him with a sufficient accounting for beauty, for morality, for language. And most of all, it could not explain the complexity of human life. He writes this: "The existence of language is one of the many phenomena of which love and music are the two strongest, which suggests that human beings are very much more than collections of meat. They convince me that we are spiritual beings, and that the religion of the incarnation, asserting that God made humanity in his image and continually restores humanity in his image, is simply true. As a working blueprint for life, as a template against which to measure experience, it fits." He continues, "My departure from the faith," which he calls his exit from the new atheism, "was like a conversion on the road to Damascus." So I mean that when he became an atheist. "My return was slow, hesitant, doubting. So it will always be. But I know I shall never make the same mistake again. Gilbert Ryle, with Dawnish absurdity, called God a category mistake. Yet the real category mistake made by atheists is not about God, but about human beings. Turn to the table talk of Samuel Coleridge. Read the first chapter of Genesis, he writes, without prejudice, and you will be convinced at once. The Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And then Coleridge adds, and man became a living soul. Materialism will never explain these last words." As a theist, when a person like A.N. Wilson writes words like these, I do think it is time for me to stop worrying. And so I confess, God is in his heaven, and all will be well. The road ahead will not always be easy. It may sometimes lead through hellish places. But as long as we can have conversations like these tonight, I believe that all will be well. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take just a minute or two off the clock as well, just at the beginning, just to thank Anna again for spending some time with me when I was working on putting together some articles, and I wanted to see if there were any sort of theological howlers in it before I sent it off, and she was a great help. So I really appreciated that, and it's wonderful that this has then moved on to a public exchange of views. Looking at the question with respect to should we worry about a godless world, I was reminded that Plato and Aristotle said that love of wisdom begins with wonder. And I was a little afraid we'd exchanged wonder for worry. But maybe an existential atheist and an existential theist meet in that sort of ground of perpetual uncomfortableness. So to some degree, I'm happy with that description. I will be, there'll be a decent chunk of overlap with respect to some of the issues that concerns I have with the new atheist movement. But I'm an atheist, and to some degree I bear homage to that new atheist movement because it pushed me over from being a kind of lazy agnostic and forced me to make a decision. And although I don't agree with all the arguments of the new atheists, to some degree I'm here because of them. Although I'm going to, at the beginning, talk a little bit about science, and particularly about Darwin, which is sort of in keeping with the kind of privileged position that the new atheists give, particularly to Darwin, obviously Dawkins and Dennett as well. So I'll be challenging aspects of their story, although I'll be looking at science, and I'll be looking at Darwin. Although there's problems with naturalism, from my standpoint, the only thing worse than naturalism is appeals to supernaturalism. So at the end of the paper, I'm going to probably spend about the first 15 minutes and sort of give a really quick account of science and some of the issues that I think come out of Darwinism, and talk about why I think those issues to some degree push the religious frame of reference off stage. And then at the end, I'm going to come back in and talk in some detail about issues that I have with their form of naturalism. But I wouldn't want the takeaway message to be that I think that naturalism has got problems that can't be lived with. I think both positions actually have substantial problems. But I think supernaturalism is the worst of the two options. One other thing, just before I start, I'll add that I don't necessarily think that am I getting a little bit of feedback there? If you want to come up, you can help me out with that. I'm not convinced that a godless world is a better one. It may in fact be, I'm open to the thought that a godless world might be worse. In fact, we might be less happy in it, and I even think we might be less empowered in it as well. So one of the things that I'll sort of go after in the latter part of, want to try that one? Sure. Close your eyes. Who would have thought I'd be recording this roving? Okay. Try that. Yeah. Okay, let's do that. I'm taking some chances. Well, we'll see. How's that? We got rid of it? Okay, excellent. Good. Okay. Yeah, so one of the things I'm going to argue or suggest at the end of the paper is that one might be happier with a kind of religious mythology. And in an odd way, one might even be more sort of psychologically empowered by it. I see no reason to think that truth is inherently ennobling or beautiful. I think that's a deep prejudice, and I see no good empirical reason to buy into it. In fact, it's one of the things I'm going to go after the new atheists on. Okay. Well, with respect to the new atheists, they've all been introduced, so I won't say much more about them. I'm going to talk primarily about Dawkins. That isn't in terms of our exchange, but with respect to atheism, I think sort of looking ahead, and it'll really be younger people here who will live through it. I think this century is going to be a century where atheism is really going to be tested in the public square, and I think that really is going to be a bumpy ride. I don't think the sort of sunshine atheism that the new atheists pronounce is a very compelling story. So to me, this is more the model of atheism that I'm going to defend today. Okay, outline for the talk. It's in five parts, in 30 minutes. I'll very quickly just, and this part will be quick because I timed it, I'm a little over, so I'm going to run through the first two sections quite quickly. The first one's just a kind of displacement argument, talking very briefly about how science has displaced religion. So it's not a refutation argument, it's a displacement argument. The second one, a little bit of kind of back to the future. I think the 19th century is instructive for the 21st century with respect to atheism, or at least the kind of atheism that I'm going to endorse. So we'll just a quick peek into the 19th century. Darwin, obviously, is a game changer. He's a game changer with respect to religion. And I'll look briefly at that. But he's also, I think, a game changer with respect to atheism in a way that isn't really picked up by the new atheists. And that's a bit of a surprise, because obviously Dawkins is arguably the living world expert on the new synthesis of neo-Darwinianism in the 20th century, and obviously the selfish gene is a landmark contribution. So, so there may be a little bit of irony in that, and I hope to be challenged from the floor, perhaps in the Q&A. Then I want to talk a little bit about the Dawkins and the sort of sunshine atheism that I think is indicative of the new atheists, and then develop one, very briefly, what I call austere atheism, which is a kind of uncomfortable atheism. Okay, so with respect to the first part then, just a kind of brief displacement story. And again, I'm going to move through this very quickly, but again, it's worth remembering that most of the religious traditions, and certainly the Christian religious tradition coming out of the Jewish religious tradition, you're looking at writings, obviously, that are put together in the Bronze Iron Age, by peoples who have a completely different worldview. Even our idea of religion is somehow distinct from other features of life, distinct from empirical knowledge, distinct. I mean, that's a very Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment way of thinking about belief. And if you're looking back to this period, it's, it's a completely integrated worldview, and there's really no separable component that's religion per se. Right? All of it's just a way of trying to make sense of the world. And it's not surprising that Iron Age people, with respect to their beliefs, that most of those beliefs wouldn't capture nature at its joints. I mean, it's a pretty primitive, workable, but fairly technologically primitive mode of engagement with nature. And of course, at least since the scientific revolution in the 17th and 18th centuries and picking up exponential momentum through the 19th and 20th centuries, our ability through science to get our fingers into the joints of nature has grown by leaps and bounds. And it isn't that we know everything. Obviously, science continues to evolve and we get new and better theories. But the kind of explanatory power we have, the predictive precision that we have, all of these things point to an incredibly powerful body of knowledge. With respect to the displacement strategy, I mean, that's sort of just running along, but just to maybe give it a slightly narrower and tighter focus, if you read back through, say, the Christian New Testament, to my mind, one of the embarrassing things when you read through those texts is the healing stories. And it's interesting if you go back through them now with, of course, an understanding of physiology, so descriptions of people thriving around on the ground in terms of demonic possession, we would now understand, and you can make sort of educated guesses. That person, probably epilepsy. The woman who was bent over for 15 years, that's probably scoliosis. It was a kind of interesting kind of story to engage in. With respect to displacement, though, I mean, if somebody's thrashing around on the floor now, we would probably think that they had epilepsy, and we'd do an MRI on them. We'd have a good close look. Maybe we'd capture a petit mal seizure in progress. And we wouldn't then say that epilepsy causes demons that cause thrashing about, right? I mean, the demonic possession story just is displaced. It doesn't do anything. It's idle. It was an explanatory story at one stage, but it's now displaced. It's not that it's refuted. You could still believe in demons and epilepsy at the same time, but it'd be a kind of queer story to use MRI machines to detect scenarios where demonic possession is taking place. So the displacement strategy just strikes me as straightforward, and it's driven by a much better, firmer, technologically mediated understanding of nature. With respect to science, if we're thinking about science, obviously we've got a kind of methodology that's evidence-driven, and of course the new atheists go on and on about this, and one could, I mean, sometimes they sound like 1940s positivists, frankly. They should probably do a little bit more philosophy of science. But nonetheless, the basic point's right, that this is a mode of engagement that's evidence-driven, and importantly, and this is something that the new atheists, I think, don't articulate well enough, it's proudly falsificationist. It invites challenge. You're not going to be a heretic or a blasphemer if you challenge the orthodoxy. That's the very vibrancy of science. That's how so radically different it is than the notion of sacred texts or deference to authority. In that sense, science is revolutionary, and it unhinges past beliefs, and it does so proudly. And I think that's science working. And it's open to everyone. Kids learning about scientific methodology, people working in labs, men, women, gay, straight. Science is an objective methodology. It's public. It demands verification in the public square with respect to repeatability of results. It's not inward-looking, it's outward-looking. And it's forward-looking, it's not backward-looking. Okay, that's a really quick thumbnail sketch, but it's just really to get you in a certain kind of headspace. With respect to Back to the Future in the 19th century, I just want to say, and I'm going to do this again quick because I want to spend a little more time talking about some of the more fundamental elements that Anna raised. But the 19th century, I think, is a century of scale in major sciences. It's where, using the science that was animating the 19th century, that human beings, through science, got a real sense of humility, that they weren't at the center of the created order, that the cosmos was on a scale that we really even couldn't get our imaginations around with respect to both spatial and temporal extent. So very quickly, if we're thinking again about cosmology, of course, most of the heavy lifting with respect to at least the structural features of cosmology is people like Copernicus and Galileo that, of course, come well before the 19th century and to some degree have complex relationships with religious authorities. But by the 19th century, certainly by the end of the 19th century, with respect to a sense of scale, we understand that we're in a galaxy. We understand that we're talking about something that involves billions of years with respect to its extent. We have a dynamic conception, it's still static state, but a dynamic conception of matter in motion, formation of solar systems, and so on. Role of gravity, and importantly in cosmology, and again, this is coming after Galileo, but it's getting manifested and worked out in detail, is the thought that there's no difference between the heavens and what goes on here. It's all one. It's all matter determined by causal laws, and there's no relevant difference between an apple falling from a tree in the Newtonian story or the moon circling around the Earth. Right? It's the same single story, unified laws explaining natural phenomena, allowing us to explain them and allowing us to, with great precision, predict them. With respect to geology, of course, geology does go through a radical transformation in the 19th century. The sort of grip of religious mythology had dominated, or at least had a tremendous influence in geology. So the notion of the flood had been something that geologists were trying to deal with in various ways, beginning of the 19th century, and you have catastrophism, which was a scientific way of trying to incorporate traditional views that largely had come from sacred text. And then you get someone like Charles Lyell and a notion of uniformism, the idea that things happen gradually by constant causal laws and over immense periods of time. So whereas someone who was perhaps influenced by Scripture, even in the beginning of the 19th century, might have thought the world was 6, or maybe if you're very generous, 10,000 years old. By the time you get to the 1830s, 1840s, you're talking about millions of years. And it's interesting that Lyell's book, the first part of the book, was something Charles Darwin took with him when he went on his famous voyage. And I think it planted a seed, a very important seed, with respect to notions of scale, in terms of temporal scale. And then lastly, of course, biology, Darwin. And I'm going to talk a lot more about Darwin, so I won't say too much now, but again, and you're familiar with it, I'm not going to start at the beginning, but just as a reminder, we're thinking about the notion of descent with modification through natural selection. Again, we're talking about scale of change, very small changes over very long periods of time. We're no longer talking about special creation of species. We're talking about a process of speciation, and we're talking about all living things coming from one or a few original forms. Important to that is the notion, of course, that things are related. All living things belong to a family of life. So meet your family. Obviously chimpanzees, and we're looking here probably diverging from the human lineage perhaps 4 to 6 million years ago. Bonobos, it's a kind of subspecies or maybe a separate species from chimps. Again, we're genetically very close to, about 98.6% of the same DNA. These little guys are fascinating. I didn't know much about them before I was starting to do my research. Very interesting group. Of course, this group's very interesting too. Male and female. Any ideas who they are? Neanderthals, which is reconstruction using relevant kinds of reconstructive technology. Neanderthals, with respect to, again, DNA, you're looking at 99.7. And in fact, there's some argument that Neanderthals are best understood as a subspecies of Homo sapiens as opposed to a separate species. And of course, Neanderthals disappeared maybe 30 to 40,000 years ago, around that time period. From pressure, no doubt, from Homo sapiens. We outcompeted them on the ground for reasons that we're not fully sure of yet. Okay, so when we think about the 19th century, we're thinking about nature understood on a vast temporal and spatial scale. We're thinking about Homo sapiens as a very small and insignificant part of the cosmic story. And we're thinking that we are determined in our nature by larger cosmic forces that operate everywhere equally. Okay, a bit about Darwin in terms of a game changer. Obviously, no notion of special creation, so everything traceable back to a few forms. If we're looking at modern man, we're probably looking at his evolution about 200,000 years ago in Africa, breaking into what's now Europe probably about 80,000 years ago. So, human beings and dinosaurs were never together, despite what you might see in one museum, maybe somewhere in the US. One of the things I want to stress here is that natural selection is a blind, random, and purposeless process. This is important. And it really comes, it's a direct implication in Darwin. By random, we don't mean it's uncaused. Obviously, it's caused, there's causal forces. But the randomness relates to the thought that the changes, and here we're going to update to the 20th century with respect to genes. Darwin didn't know about genes, of course. There was some basis for heredity. But the changes at that level and their expressions in phenotypes, there's no correlation, right, between the change and the effect. It's that aspect that's random. And of course, most changes are going to be deleterious to the organism, right? If you have a complicated sports car and you go in and you put something additionally in there, it's probably going to screw it up because there's a kind of unity of that thing, and you change any little feature of it, and you may well throw off things. So the overwhelming, on a huge scale, the overwhelming number of mutations turn out to be deleterious to the organism. It won't get through the embryonic stage. If it does, it won't last very well. It probably won't live to reproductive success. And then there's a very few of those, a minuscule number of those, that will prove to be either neutral, and they get picked up in genetic drift, or they will prove to be beneficial. And all things being equal, there'll be some adaptive advantage, and then that gene will outcompete gene pools that don't have that gene in them. So blind, random, and purposeless. Okay, I want to use Charles Kingsley as a kind of interesting test case for two sets of implications that come from Darwin. And to me, these bury the theological frame. And then they open up, as I say, some issues that I have with the new atheists. But I want to use him as a test case. Charles Kingsley was an Anglican priest. He lived between 1817 and 1875. Fascinating figure. He's a priest. He was the chaplain to Queen Victoria. So he was pretty well connected. And he was a friend of Darwin. And Darwin sent him an advanced copy of The Origin of Species a few weeks before the first edition was published in 1859. And Kingsley read it and wrote back, and you can read this in Darwin's letters, fascinating exchanges, saying, this is a wonderful theory, I fully support it. In fact, so much so that Darwin then included a reference to this in the second edition of The Origin of Species. Kingsley thought, look, there needn't be any conflict between science and religion. And obviously this has echoes, I think, with the century that we're in with respect to religious apologists. So you get two strategies. The first one that Kingsley used, he said, well, we'll just identify natural selection as God's method for the creation and maintenance and development of life. This is how God chooses. An all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving being chooses natural selection with respect to the method for developing living things. The second strategy he adopted, you might use Stephen Jay Gould's language of two magisteria, because it really anticipates Gould's description, which is the idea that science does facts, religion does values. So religion's sort of in this rear guard action. Eventually it gives up on all facts. It's not making any factual claims about anything. It was always really only about value. And that's where Kingsley ends. Now, with respect to the first approach, is anticipated by Darwin himself. And this is an exchange of letters. I'm just showing you a picture of a particular kind of wasp. It's an example Darwin gives in a letter in 1860, a year after the publication of the first edition of The Origin. And it's in response to this idea that God, an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving being, chooses natural selection as the method for developing living things and expresses his concern for them. And this is Darwin. Again, this is in a private letter. With respect to the theological view of the question, this is always painful to me. I am bewildered. I had no intention to write atheistically, but I own that I cannot see as plainly as others should, and I should wish to, evidence of design and beneficence on all sides of us. There seems to me too much misery in the world. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and all-powerful God would have designedly created the ichneumon with the expressed intention of feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that a cat should play with mice. This is a particularly nasty parasitic relation. The wasp stings the caterpillar, which paralyzes it, and then lays eggs inside it. And then the larvae, very slowly and carefully, eat out the inside of the caterpillar and avoids the neurological structure of the caterpillar, leaving it till last to keep the caterpillar alive as long as possible. It's a grotesque but emblematic expression of natural selection's genius. Now, you might try to get away from this with a kind of Woody Allen-esque quip. If it turns out that there is a God, the worst that can be said about him is that he's basically an underachiever. But I don't think that's really going to work here. I think you have to give up on the thought. You either give up on the thought that he's all-powerful, or you give up on the thought that he's all-knowledgeable, or you give up on the thought that he's all-good. I don't think you can keep all three. I think if you give up on any one of those, you may have theological trouble. And of course, if you read the Bible, in just one section, Matthew 10, where Jesus says, yet not one of them will fall, he was talking about birds, yet not one of them will fall to the ground without your Father's knowledge. Okay, what about the second strategy, the two magisteria strategy? Well, this has substantial costs. If you say religion isn't about facts, you hollow out distinctly religious belief to begin with. And the second part of it, of course, religion's about morality, and that's all it was ever really about anyway. Well, obviously, you give up on all the facts. Forget about cosmology, geology, biology, and all the other ologies. But you also start hollowing out claims within the religion traditions itself, whether it's Garden of Eden, whether it's Noah's Ark, whether it's Exodus, whether it's the Immaculate Conception, whether it's Lazarus, whether it's the resurrection, and I could go on. Particularly that last one. If you're a Christian, you may have trouble giving that up. I know there are certain schools of Christianity that abandon the doctrine of the resurrection. I think that's a pretty difficult one to give up. Also, obviously, biblical scholarship, scientifically tailored. We get a rich and complex understanding of the various hands that wrote sacred texts, the audiences to which they were directed, the inconsistencies, the politics, the all too human aspects of text. And pretty soon the texts look more human than sacred. What about if you go what about the other feature of it? Well, it was always about moral instruction anyway. Given that Kierkegaard was mentioned by Anna, I thought this would probably be a useful one. Of course, Kierkegaard makes a lot of this. The Sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, where Abraham is willing to sacrifice. He believes God's asking him to do it, and binds his son, and just before he kills his son, an angel tells him not to. Kierkegaard said this was the move from the ethical to the religious. This emblematically expressed the move from ethical, reason-based moral engagement to something beyond reason-based moral engagement. And I think Kierkegaard's right. And I think this is very dangerous. I don't think this is a model of moral engagement that people ought to, for reasons, endorse. This is a painting, always one that disturbs me, of the Massacre of the Innocents. Now, of course, this painting was about Herod, right? At least in one of the Gospels, where all the firstborn are killed because he believes that Christ has been born. But of course, if you go into the Old Testament, it's a sad and uncomfortable truth, again, depending on which side. Sometimes it's viewed as a massacre, as in this case. Other times it's viewed as expressing God's will. In Numbers 31, for example, now therefore kill every male and the little ones, and kill every woman that hath known man by lying with him. But all the women children that have not known a man by lying with him, that's to say all the virgins, I guess, keep alive for yourselves. Now again, you can pick and choose, and you can find uncomfortable passages, and I'm not pressing them, and I know Anna's certainly not endorsing those by any means. But if you think that moral engagement should be framed by reference to sacred text, not in terms of reasons and the complicated story of reasons, of course, that's a diverse story. Hard to get agreement, hard to think about what, that's all a lot of hard work that you have to do in moral philosophy to try to find the best way of moving that discussion forward. But you don't do it by referring to religious tradition. I think this is just dangerous, and I think it's one of the good things that happens as religion begins to recede from the public square. Okay, so neither Kingsley's strategies, to my mind, work. You can't get Darwin into natural theology. You can't remove theology from the domain of the factual. You can't run away from Darwin. You can't run with him. You just get run over by him. But I don't think the corrosive effects of Darwinism end there. And I guess maybe this is the bit where Anna and I will be some areas of agreement, although I think perhaps for different reasons. I think the Darwinian story, properly understood, without the sunshine utopianism that tends to frame the new atheist project, I think it has corrosive effects for atheism as well. This is T.H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog. Fascinating figure. And I often think, Dawkins' public intellectual work is very much in the spirit of the best traditions of Huxley. Here's a piece from Huxley again in a private letter. There is amazingly little evidence of referential care in the arrangements of nature that I can discover. If our ears were sharp enough to hear all the cries of pain that are uttered in the earth by men and beasts, we should be deafened by one continuous scream. And again, Darwin, just very briefly, again in a private letter to Hooker, he described evolution as clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horridly cruel. So I think when you're looking at the Darwinian story, you're looking at the story of an efficiently, marvelously ingenious, blind slaughterhouse. It's a slaughterhouse in which gives rise to a tremendous variety of living things that we all share a common ancestry about. But I think the sharpness of that worldview change from natural theology, where religion and biology were together until 1859, because it seemed like there was purposefulness and order in the world, to what Darwin gives us, that was felt acutely by the principal players in the period, Darwin and Huxley. And I think the edge of that has mysteriously disappeared with respect to this sunshine atheism that looks so much to Darwin among the new atheists. And that's really what I want to pursue now. I'm just going to move it. If we're thinking about, again, the natural order, the cuckoo is, the bird on your left is not the mother. That's the cuckoo. The mother is the little sparrow. So, cuckoos go into nests, lay their eggs, and roll out all the other eggs as soon as the hatchling is born, and then the hardwired response of the female bird is to feed the offspring, even when it gets a little dangerous. And of course, the standard mutual of the homos wild kingdom kind of account of nature, which is the generic aspect of natural relations. And then this, I don't have time, is another absolutely bizarre parasitic story, but I'm going to leave that. Back to sunshine atheism. Probably no God, stop worrying, enjoy your life. Okay, so up to Dawkins. What concerns me with the new atheists is the kind of shadowless landscape that they paint for public consumption. These atheists, sunshine atheists, offer a picture of the scientific understanding of nature that bleaches out, to my mind at least, the complex, darker hues that were evident in the 19th century. I think, like guests to a party in the 21st century, we're invited to grab a drink and think just how lucky we are to be living in a century where finally superstition is being pushed to the fringe, and finally we get real awe, wonder, majesty that science is going to deliver. I think one of the defining aspects of the new atheist movement is this desire, to my mind, I can understand for public relations purposes, but I can't understand its deep philosophical significance, to outshine the charms of religion. There's a kind of deep-seated commitment to the thought that since science is the best tracker of truth, we should expect atheism to offer up an invigorating, ennobling conception of life. And maybe this is just because atheists sort of feel the pressure, which sometimes comes from the religious worldview, that, well, science is going to explain everything. It's sort of going to put a cap on our imagination. It's going to remove a certain kind of transcendental aspect of our nature. And of course, Dawkins has worked long and hard to dispel that. He's written a number of important books on this. I'm going to move this forward a little bit, but if you want to read Unweaving the Rainbow, it's a wonderful defense of the notion of awe, wonder, and majesty in contemporary science. But to my mind, if we're thinking about these sort of three, which seem to be major commitments of the new atheists, they have a real echo. a philosopher is going to, the notion of the true, the beautiful, and the good is sort of being bound together is a very Platonic notion. But with respect to how it gets played out by the new atheists, the notion of awe and wonder is very much the engineer's perspective. Right? They see sort of in the engineering of natural selection majesty, simplicity, and a general opening up of the human imagination. But insofar as we entertain a sense of wonder and awe in the ever-changing and endlessly inventive kill or be killed strategies that natural selection throws up, I'm reminded of the military engineer in Sidney Lumet's film Failsafe, who in the midst of a particularly tense moment in the unfolding tragedy of a possible nuclear exchange between the superpowers, is heard to spontaneously say, "Beautiful," as the technology for waging nuclear war responds with inspiring precision. An engineer with his head down will find beauty in the most unlikely of places. Of course, even this engineer's sense of wonder is an overstatement when it pertains to nature. Natural selection is tremendously wasteful, blindly repetitive, ridiculously bottlenecked, and subject to endless happenstance. In large measure, the aesthetic feeling of awe and majesty, when they emerge, describe what Dawkins has described elsewhere. I think it comes from a notion of kind of a middle world imagination. In this case, an act of naturalistic grace that our limited imagination readily grants as we take in the relatively few surviving creatures of nature and remain artfully deaf to the Huxleyan scream. Perhaps this selective attention is a well-functioning sleight of hand, as hardwired as our ability to focus our attention on a conversation in a crowded room. Maybe a welcome natural buffer from the noisy, obscene cruelty that otherwise fills the party. Both Darwin and Huxley in the 19th century were well aware that the bill for nature's bounty is paid in full, 3 times filled and running over. I'm just going to move this forward because I know we're moving in time. I've probably got about 5 minutes left. This notion that the truth is sort of fundamental, it's intoxicating, it's awe-inspiring, is so much, and if you watch Dawkins in action, it's sort of the modus operandi. To my mind, it shares a certain kind of similarity to religious transcendence. It sounds a bit like John in 8:32, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." But why should truth be automatically ennobling? Couldn't it be morally disabling? Mightn't it be ugly? I think atheists do better if they give up the Annie got your gun, Irving Berlin, anything you can do, I can do better shouting match that they have with theists. I think a less inflated atheism, let's call it austere atheism, might prove a more empirical, sober option. It jettisons the residual religious aura attached to truth and offers no magical inoculation against the press of terror that the inner pulse of natural selection, for example, signals in its unvarnished form. Okay. I've just got a couple minutes left, so it's just a kind of brief survey of some of the things I've just been discussing. We're thinking about, roll that one back, particular concerns in a godless world. I'm going to skip the social Darwinism stuff. I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. I think it's an important and interesting issue. I'm particularly interested, though, in the thought, and again, this is, to my mind, a kind of lazy commitment that the new atheists have, that once we have a scientific worldview, we will just help ourselves to the existing conceptual repertoire that we have in culture, and we'll just then do all those things, but we'll now do them better, because we've got our fingers in the joints of nature, and we can now really do it in a way that people who are appealing to supernatural fairies, as Dawkins is keen to describe it, couldn't. And that view strikes me as incredibly naive. And I'll just sort of key in on a couple of points. One of them is in notions like equality, for example. There's a kind of fixed repertoire, right, of concepts that come out of the Enlightenment. And Enlightenment thinkers like Kant and others, to some degrees, help themselves to a kind of religious tradition. And they secularize notions. So the notion of the self, the essential self, that you get in the 18th and 19th century, to some degree gets rooted, plugged in to the old concept of the soul. Equality, to some degree, comes out of a notion of equal before God. Democracy comes from a notion of equality and a notion of a kind of secular city as opposed to in relationship to the city of God. So to some degree, those secularized notions have a kind of history, and they were planted in a kind of reality. Now, it was false. The religious beliefs were false, and now they have to be abandoned. But the question is then, what happens to that linkage? What happens if that Enlightenment story was grafted onto a religious worldview that is no longer worthy of belief? It would be a peculiar kind of cosmic coincidence if you could go from a religious worldview to a man-centered worldview, and somehow the religious concepts would just one-to-one correlate with the new scientific understanding of what man is, or human beings are, and what our moral capacities are. I think the argument here has to be something more like, when the scientific view comes into play, it's going to shake clean the Etch-a-Sketch. It isn't simply going to be a gradualist movement. It's going to be something that's much more revolutionary. Once we have a different concept of what a human being is, once we give up on supernaturalism and the sort of momentum that came out of supernaturalism into the Enlightenment and brought many notions like equality and the self to us in a secular landscape that still had religious roots, it would be really weird to think that somehow the scientific view would just neatly one-to-one graft onto that story and then just do it better. To my mind, it isn't that we're going to have better solutions. We're going to have different kinds of problems. And there's certain, I think, features, relevant features that come out of that. It isn't simply going to be a kind of, you'll see Sartre and Camus in this picture, it isn't simply going to be a kind of existentialist, well, we just have to put our stamp on experience in this new atheist world in a kind of rebel posture. Instead, a naturalized understanding of human beings may well frame us in a way that makes us a kind of hobbled insider. Right? There is nothing outside. There's no space in which the rebel can stand. Notions of free will and freedom themselves will get transformed in a new scientific understanding. In fact, they already are. If you look at sentencing in courts right now, one of the things that is brought in when you do MRIs on certain people who are described as having certain kinds of self-control problems is that this can ameliorate against certain kinds of prison sentences, because the thought is, well, they didn't choose. They were propelled by nature in a certain course. That's just the beginning of a different way of thinking about what it is to be free, to make choices, to be subject to blame, to be subject to praise, and all of the moral and political categories that follow from it. And I'll take 2 minutes and I'll be done. If you look at the Michelangelo's Pieta, right, which is Mary with the Christ figure, this is a story just before redemption, right, where human beings in the mythical account have redemption and wholeness. There's a completeness in the story. If you think about King Lear at the end, and Lear was written about 8 years after Michelangelo made that statue, I sometimes think there may have been a link. This is the negative, gender negative opposite. It's not Mary holding her son, it's Lear holding his dead Cordelia. And if you know the end of Lear, it's an appallingly tragic scene. Cordelia, Cordelia, stay a little. To which we get this 5 by 5, never, 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 never. It's a moment without redemption. And in fact, it's interesting that Lear, after 40 years, it was rewritten. The ending was rewritten with a happy ending that was on the stage for about 160 years. And in fact, it was just when Darwin came back in about 1839 that the tragic version of Lear hit the stage again. This is a different model. I think it's one that atheists will have to deal with, dealing with the finitude of life, dealing with the reality of death, dealing with the thought that redemption and wholeness is no longer part of the story. And what does, when you had a mythology, notions of certain kinds of fears could be sublimated within that larger framework. What happens when that mythical account of a return to wholeness is no longer possible? I don't know. I think along with a revolutionary new understanding of what it is to be a human, you may see substantial cultural shifts as that kind of energy finds a way of revealing itself. Maybe new grand secular projects displace that notion of wholeness. I think, and even experiences like love of those you care about, as in this case again from the Seventh Seal. Those are conceptual, they're discursive. If we begin to think, we feel them as if they're unbounded, as if people always felt this way about love. But that's a social construction. It's informed by a certain kind of conceptual milieu. If instead of thinking that you're driving a car and one day you end up back in with a loving father, if instead you think you're driving a car towards a concrete wall, how does that change your posture individually? How does it change how you experience your relationship with others? How does it change cultural expressions of things like fear of death? I don't know. I think those are all fundamental features that atheists are going to have to deal with, as opposed to the sort of sunny version we get with the new atheists. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
I realize oxygen is beginning to thin in the room. Hopefully, you'll bear with us. Would you like to have a moment? Are you ready to roll?
Are we going to do the Q&A up here?
No, we're going to get 5-minute rebuttal.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
5 to 7 minutes. Anna?
Thank you, Paul, very much for elaborating so much of both your concerns with the new atheism, but also elaborating your view of atheism. And I think you probably can guess from the things that I said and from some of the things that Paul said that if I were an atheist, I would be Paul's brand of atheist. I can say that. I'll concede that much. I would be Paul's brand of atheist. But of course, I'm not an atheist. And so there are, of course, many points on which we differ. We would agree that there is an insufficiency of naturalism to explain everything. There is an insufficiency to it. But I don't, of course, share his idea that supernaturalism is insufficient in the same way. I think that one of the biggest insufficiencies of naturalism that is not answered and has not really been answered for us in any form of atheism is what do we do about that innate human search for meaning? What do we do with that? And there is no answer with that. And I think that that part of what Paul elaborates is that existential search that perhaps leads us to places we can't yet imagine. And I think that what we find in theism is not just a pie in the sky when you die, but an elaboration of a hope that entered history that we then pursue and does actually provide us with a sense of meaning for life. That if we live and occupy a space in a closed box of cause and effect, repeating over and over and over again, there is no way of being released from that trap that is our human life. And what theism tells us is that actually there is more to life than that, and that there is this deep search for meaning that can be satisfied. Regarding the compatibility of science and religion, it's fascinating because there are many scientists who don't see an incompatibility at all between science and religion. And I mentioned a couple, but I would like to highlight again Francis Collins, who, as you probably know, has led the Human Genome Project. And he started out as a staunch atheist. He talks about, in a book that he wrote, about how he became an atheist as he studied science and realized that he needed to dispense with any idea of God. But as he was working as a medical student and so on, he started to find that there were questions that he could not answer from a naturalistic point of view. And he talked to his friends and he started reading C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And he came upon the idea of natural law, natural moral law, that there is this sense within us, that there is a good and an evil and something beyond ourselves that points us towards a good and an evil. And so that started him on that path. And then if you read his story, it's the experience of wonder at the human genome, of what he calls the whole plan of God for the design of the universe. And he agrees with evolution. He does not dispense with that idea. But to see that whole plan laid out before your eyes was just an amazing experience for him. And as I said before, he is now a committed Christian. So not all scientists see there being an eternal antithesis between science and religion. In fact, theologically, if you're wondering, we can look at the opening chapters of Genesis in two ways, and the interpreter John Goldingay does just that. And he talks about how when we look at those chapters, we could compare it with a band going into a studio to produce a record. And he said you could do it one of two ways. Some bands get together, they go into the studio, they jam about for a week, and then they come up with a record, and it's awesome. Another group of people will plan. They'll write the songs, they'll organize it, they'll go in, they'll construct it, and they'll produce the album. It'll be an amazing album. And he says what we have in the opening chapters of Genesis are two accounts, really, of creation. One that is that God said, God said, God said, an ordered sense of creation. And don't get me wrong, I'm not actually a young earth creationist, even though I'm saying God says. We're talking about the explanation of the universe here. So God speaks and something comes into being. But there's also in the opening chapters of Genesis, God saying, let the earth bring forth. Let the earth bring forth. It's a bit of a mess, potentially, and beyond our understanding in many ways. So theologically, we are not without an ability to understand why evolution might seem very messy. But even then, it is not always easy to reconcile these things, and I will concede that point. However, we do often say that I can't believe in a God who. I cannot believe in a God who does X, Y, Z, or a world in which X, Y, or Z happens. How can this happen when there is a God? And there are a number of questions around this. I'm going to just pick out one or two. I think I'd like to point really to C.S. Lewis's experience, really, of this, where he wondered, he said, when he was an atheist, he started to wonder, he hadn't been a believer because he thought that there was too much injustice in the world. He looked around the world, he saw evil, injustice, and things that just he couldn't reconcile at all with the idea of God. And then he said it occurred to him, where did I get this very idea of just and unjust, good and bad? That doesn't reside within the naturalistic worldview itself. It comes from somewhere else. And so for him, this idea that there's this innate natural sense that there is a good and an evil, a just and an unjust, was evidence for him that there was a God, that we have this sense that there's a way that things in the world should be. There's a way they should be, but they aren't. And he says we all have this sense, and that led him to make a commitment of faith. I think you're right, Paul, that the resurrection is a key for theists. The resurrection really is the clincher. As your namesake in the scriptures tells us, if there's no resurrection...
Ugh.
I mean, there were many times preparing for this talk I'd write, according to Paul, and I'd have to kind of back up. Which Paul are we talking about? But you're right. The biblical Paul tells us that if the resurrection has not happened, we are to be pitied above all others, because we're fools, basically, to believe something like that if it has not happened. But I would like to offer an invitation to all atheists to consider the evidence for Jesus, because Christians actually do believe it happened in history, and there's evidence that can be examined and demonstrated. And so I invite you to consider that, and to consider the whole power of resurrection when we look at even how the world works from a scientific point of view, how new life comes from death and so on. There's, again, not an incompatibility there. When we consider the future of potentially giving up our religious understanding as human beings, I think that some of the points that I made are that that's quite unlikely to happen in many ways, and yet the influence is there around us. But there are historical examples of what happens when we dispense with the idea that all human beings have dignity because they bear the image of God. This is a basic understanding that I think as a society we lose at our peril. The idea that all human beings, every single one, regardless of background, of appearance, of whatever, has the image of God that gives them an inherent dignity and therefore demands a certain treatment from other people, a certain protection, a certain respect that we need to have for one another. And if we dispense with that view, then I think that we do so at our peril. And I know that you say, Paul, that it might be perilous. And I would be reluctant to dispense with that, not only because it's perilous, but because I believe that it is a true account of the way that things are. At very least, I know which of those futures I would prefer to inhabit. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And we'll turn the podium over to Paul for 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay. I'm not going to take the 5 to 7 minutes because I think I probably cheated and added 5 minutes to my talk, and I imagine people want to ask some questions, so I'll just take 2 minutes. And just pick up a couple of thoughts. I mean, the argument, and I know these are just gestures at arguments because we don't have a lot of time to develop them, but the thought that issues about justice require a religious approach strikes me as an undermotivated claim. I mean, there's lots of philosophical approaches to justice that, of course, predate Jesus of Nazareth. The Greeks made a pretty good run at it. And there are many other traditions, of course, that have made a pretty good run at it, secular ones as well. So, I mean, I don't take that as a powerful argument, although I do recognize that there is a powerful conception of justice and mercy and forgiveness in Christianity that obviously in different ways has permeated Western culture. And I think some of those features, and certainly secular humanists, people like Philip Kitcher and others, are attentive to the downsides of what happens as religion in the developed West continues its retreat with respect to how those forms of commitment and social policy are going to be picked up when as we see, you think about sort of the demise of religion, you don't have to go further than your local newspaper real estate section with respect to churches, particularly in this area, to see what's happening on the ground. And so I think those concerns are real concerns, and I recognize that Christianity does have a story to tell, but my goodness, it's not the only story, and it may not even be the best story. In the talk, issues about certain kinds of experiences of love, experiences of music, those kinds of experiences have a kind of almost timeless transcendental quality to them. And certainly, particularly Dawkins has written a great deal on this, and I think much of it's quite good. And clearly, Atheist. I mean, I enjoyed the Beethoven, the Ode to Joy that we had before this started, and I also enjoyed the Stravinsky Rite of Spring. We're trying to find a nice contrast. So, issues of aesthetic involvement clearly have a certain kind of phenomenal feel to them. But again, I don't think any of that's inherently connected to a particular religious tradition. Okay, that's all I want to say. I think we can open things up to Q&A.
Thank you, Paul. We get a little feedback here. We've got three mics at close proximity. At this point, we'd like to open the conversation to the audience, and I would ask anyone who would like to please raise your hand, and we'll try to address people in an orderly fashion, and please be aware that there are many people in the room, and many of whom probably would like to ask a question or make a point as well. So, please.
My question is to Paul.
Yeah.
You paint the universe in a very Lovecraftian way, in terms of nature and cosmos. It's unimaginable scale, unimaginable horror, and it holds things that are not as beautiful as the Dawkinsian atheism puts it.
Right.
And there's certainly truth to what you're saying, but as an altruistic animal, at this current moment in our history, we are doing excellently. Violence is at a major decline, and people are freer than they have ever been. Do you honestly think that there is a darker future that awaits us?
No, it's just more of just an uncertain one. I mean, I think the sort of momentum of the Enlightenment has carried us to a certain point, and you're quite right. I mean, Steven Pinker's recent book on the decline of violence and on our better angels of our nature. Thank you. It's a wonderful expose, putting again to bed the thought that things are going to hell in a handbasket and there was a golden time. I mean, that's sort of the grip of that mythology, whether it's in its classical form of the Golden Age or its Christian form. We've never lived better. We've never seen lower rates of violence, even taking into account the atrocities that happened in the Second World War on a per capita basis. I think Pinker gives a very compelling argument with respect to the decline in violence across a whole host of domains using relevant metrics. So, and I think that's largely a kind of story of the delivery of a kind of Enlightenment ideal that really found its feet in the 18th century and had momentum through the 19th and had an uneven, complex story in the 20th century, but to some degrees delivered the good, again, with technology and all the things that this room highlights in so many different ways that we just take for granted. So, so no issues there. I'm not suggesting that that we live in the worst of times. I think we live in the best of times. But I think the transition that's ahead with respect to certain kinds of fundamental concepts, as I say, like equality, like the notion of the self, like the notion of the free will, and notions of freedom and choice, and all the moral and political and legal categories that come out of that, are already being tested in various ways, are already beginning to find the feel of a certain kind of transformative power with a new image of what it is to be human, a scientific image of what it is to be human. And I think as religion continues its retreat, the hollowing out of those Enlightenment commitments that granted a certain kind of stability to that project will become increasingly evident. And I don't know what that future looks like, but it's going to play itself out, no doubt, in this century. And that's one of the reasons I'm an uncomfortable atheist. I think we ride the back of a tiger here.
Maybe both of you can speak to the problem of mobility, testability. So the way I would understand atheism's issue is we're arguing from within a closed system and somehow establishing that the system is closed. So we assume that we can use a natural argument or that we have a test to say testability is the only way to determine what's true. I think the tension for Dr. Robbins is that she's arguing from events which, whether they occur or not, can't necessarily recur. So we can't prove that an event happened. We can find evidence for it, but we can't redo it. We can't redo the resurrection and the incarnation. In other words, it's something that is also kind of beyond the pale. So how does that issue of epistemology affect either of your positions?
Did you want me to talk first? Well, I mean, events are event types. If you're a scientist, you're thinking about what are the causal conditions under which particular types of events, what are their antecedents, what give rise to them, what are the consequences, what natural laws are in play. As I say, the argument I gave in the talk was a displacement strategy. That's not a refutation strategy. And although I'm not getting into the minutiae of philosophical discussion for those who are attuned to the wider framework, I'm probably more like a methodological naturalist than a metaphysical naturalist. So I think science has a certain kind of methodological approach with respect to certain canons of evidence, the continual struggle for falsification, and I think that's why science works so well. But can that methodology prove that something non-natural can't be? No, that would be metaphysical naturalism. But I think in terms of a displacement strategy, and that's to some degree a kind of story about history and culture, that, as I said, with the sort of demonic possession CAT scan or MRI scan example, what science does is it displaces the religious narrative. It doesn't refute it. Is that helpful? Okay.
Is it on? Yep, good. I think there is an epistemological issue here, certainly, and Christians, although theism contributed to the development of the Enlightenment epistemology, we also sometimes have found ourselves trapped within it for the kind of reasons that you suggest. So the event of the resurrection, what do we do with that? It's obviously, if it happened, something beyond natural explanation happened. So we can even ever only go so far with what we can explain within a naturalistic framework. And that's why I would disagree, for example, with Dawkins, who believes that, you know, there can't be a God because we're positing something infinitely complex that preceded the simple. And I think that if we're talking about knowledge of something that is from without the naturalistic framework, then we don't need to have that as a problem. It's interesting, too, though, that beyond Western epistemology, I'm just starting to realize, I'm slow, that there are, of course, other epistemologies amongst people groups where complexity is the starting point. How interesting. So I think there's still something for us to learn in further engagement beyond our Western paradigms. Thanks for the question.
I'm listening to this with great enthusiasm, and as an old, over the 80 citizen of this little planet Earth, I have been through all kinds of situations where religion happens to screw up the normal procedure of human beings. Like I'm originally from Yugoslavia, where Yugoslavia disintegrated due to Croatians being Roman Catholics and Serbs being Eastern Orthodox and whatever. Now, all of these theoretical issues, or whether something is true or not true in the Bible, okay, that might be interesting. But I would like you to address the issue that all of this warfare between Shia and Sunni, and as I mentioned, between Catholics and Protestants, in Africa, I don't know how many thousands of different variations of religion are used for slaughtering other human beings. I feel that the shift towards secularism is the only hope of the human beings to save this little planet Earth from idiocy of one-sidedness. Thank you.
You have claimed that religion screws things up, and I think there's no question that there are times when religion screws things up, and I think that that's because I believe that people screw things up, and religions are made up of people.
People who are secularists, they would not kill somebody because
well, I mean, we might need another night to discuss that, but I think there are certainly historical examples of people who were not God believers who led some pretty serious atrocities in the world. And so people are driven by ideology. Sometimes religious people are driven by ideology. Sometimes political people are driven by ideology. When people are driven by ideologies, it leads them to do all kinds of things. But being a religious person doesn't necessarily mean that you're being driven by an ideology. I believe that all of us screw things up. One way or another, we all screw things up. When we gather together under a particular oppression or whatever it is, we can screw things up on a collective level. And that's when we end up with things like wars and visiting these kinds of atrocities on each other. But I think if you eliminated religion from the world scene, again, we'd need another night to unpack these kinds of things in the kind of detail that we've been saying we've been missing by covering so many topics. But I'm just simply not convinced that if religion were removed from the picture, we would all live at peace, like John Lennon claimed. I just don't believe it.
Thank you. In the middle.
Me? This is for Paul. You made one point, I'm not sure if it was your point or a paraphrase, that the truth is sometimes morally disabling. Was that? And if you could just elaborate on that, because when I heard that, my thoughts were would it be more morally sound to tell someone the truth or to sort of blanket it over because you know that it's going to cripple them in some way?
Yeah, I mean, you can think of lots of scenarios where, for all the right reasons, you withhold the truth. These situations of people in terminal illness, or I don't mean you don't. I'm not talking about medical ethics, but I had a grandmother, and she was 101, and she'd lived through the Blitz and wonderful kind of Edwardian sensibilities. And but near the end of her life, her memory was going, and she wouldn't recognize me, and she would think I was a brother of hers back in England in the 1920s. I wouldn't correct her on that. I mean, it was just, I loved her, and I just sort of silently play along with that. But in the talk, what I was trying to refer to is that there's a thought that knowing the truth is somehow ennobling and also empowering. And I don't see why that should be the case. I mean, if you think about like a tightrope walker does best by not looking down. A certain sense of blissful ignorance is helpful for the realization of the task. And if the tightrope walker is attentive to the space between where he is and where the ground is, he may be more likely to fall. I think there's all sorts of cases like that where the truth can be quite ugly, and it may in fact disable us in certain ways. And I don't have this fully worked out, but it's one of the features of this slight uncomfortable atheist position that I have, that it may well be that the more we come to know human beings and our capacities and our limits and the evolutionary set of capacities that we have, both for empathy but also for bloodlust, that the Enlightenment story, which was emancipatory and universalistic, might become threatened in serious ways. And in that sense, knowing more about us might be morally disabling. That's what I was thinking.
I'm intrigued by this idea that you keep positing that human beings have a tremendous capacity to screw things up. And I, from being a lifelong atheist, I'm proud of it, I believe that human beings have an innate ability to screw things up because of religion. The solution you offer is, in fact, the problem. And interestingly enough, I was an atheist and committed to that long before Dawkins and the other scientists got at it. I don't need a mechanistic, scientific explanation to support my view, my belief. Rather, I believe in human beings. I believe that we are, as I stand here tonight, and all of us in this room, our own best hope for everything. And that religion teaches me not to believe that. Religion teaches me that I am born in sin, that I need to be redeemed, that I have done something wrong by breathing. I don't accept that. I want a hopeful, joyful life without needing to please somebody else, somewhere else. So, therefore, if religion would give up on that and let us be as good as we are, the world would be a better place. My question is, do you really believe that I cannot be good and I am not good because I don't believe in God? Do you believe that the Mayans and Innu and Polynesians, that the Egyptians and Buddhists and Confucians are not good? None of them love their children. None of them help their neighbors. None of them ever seek peace. They could only do that if they believed in the Christian God. Is that what you are actually telling me?
That's absolutely not what I'm saying.
Then why are you saying to me that I only can screw things up?
I'm saying we all...
Yes, we can all make things better.
We can. Oh, I agree.
Right. Get rid of Christianity.
There are many things I could say. Oh, for the grace. I will. Yeah, no, I mean, well, let me answer your question and I'll tell you what I think, all right? This is what I think. I think that it is absolutely possible to be good without being a Christian. And I know lots of people, as you say, who love their children, who want peace in the world and all those sorts of things. I like Paul very much, and he's an atheist. Do I think he can do good? Of course I think that he can do good. You're an atheist. Do I think? Of course I think that you can do good. But what I don't have from a naturalistic perspective is an explanation for why we have this sense of good. What is good anyway? You said you don't want to be answerable to someone else, that you want to be accountable to yourself. Well, what if myself wants to go over and just kick that person in the head right now? What if I just want to get out a gun and blow some people away because it makes me feel good? You know, I don't want to be accountable to anyone else. I want to, but that's not what you're saying, is it? You're saying we seem to have within human beings a capacity and a desire to do well and good. And what doesn't come to me from a naturalistic worldview is an explanation for why that's there. And that's why I point to C.S. Lewis, because he looks and he says, when I look at that, I have to believe that there is a natural law that is born in all of us that leads us towards doing good things, but also has within us the capacity to screw it up. So it's both and.
The problem. Give it up. Listen to Beckett. Godot is not coming. Not today, not tomorrow, next week.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so you make a lot of points about why religion offers that explanation for the world, like we need it to be moral, or you don't really say we can appreciate things like love and beauty, or this innate search for spirituality that humans kind of have. But my question is, so even if religion is necessary, even if someone grants you that there is a God, that we do need some sort of greater thing, how can you be so sure that Christianity is the right answer? Because if you believe in God and worship the wrong one, you're risking your damnation. I mean, at the end of the day, aren't you really just claiming and pretending to know things you cannot possibly know?
That's not my view of the faith that I have. My students will know this story, that when I grew up in a church, but not from a Christian family. And so I've had Christian belief for a long time, but not of a mature variety, I will say that. And it wasn't until I was at least in high school, that I actually found out that historians agreed that the man Jesus Christ actually existed in history. I thought I was believing in fairy tales and good for me, you know, believing against all the evidence. Then I found out, oh my goodness, historians agree that Jesus Christ existed. And then as you go on and you investigate, they not only agree he existed, they agree that he died. They agree that the reliability of the documents that we have around the things that he taught and the things that happened with him are extraordinarily reliable. And when I hear people still give papers on them and talk about them, it still blows my mind because I can't believe how much reliability there is around it. So although I did say we will not prove the existence of God by reason, that doesn't therefore mean that the faith that I have is unreasonable. And so I think it is incumbent upon me to pursue reasons for why I hold that faith, not just to say I shut my eyes against the world and I believe against all that I see, but to find, is there evidence for it? Are the accounts of the Gospels reliable? Did this man Jesus exist? What happened? What did he say? What did he teach? How did he die? And the eyewitness accounts that he rose again, is it possible? I mean, if we rule that out of hand before we actually explore it, then I think we're not doing ourselves a full service of rational investigation.
Thank you. Yeah. There's very good documentary evidence that the Emperor Augustus was said to be a god. I don't believe the Emperor Augustus was a god, nor Caesar, nor Claudius, nor Odin, nor the gods of the Babylonians, nor the gods of the Sumerians. There are just too many gods that we've already abandoned. With tons of documentary evidence that that people built temples to Augustus, temples to Caesar, temples to Claudius, a whole bunch of them. I don't think just the existence of documents really cuts it for me in the face of just so many abandoned religions. I mean, this one, to me, the Christianity racket, it will go in another 100 or 200 years. The religion of Zoroaster lasted about 1500. No, I still know some people who worship Zoroaster, but to me it just seems to be more of the same.
I would point to the 2.18 billion Christians that exist in the world today. It's going to take a while.
Mark.
I'm an atheist. I don't like to be an atheist, but being an atheist, we love to create these anecdotes as to the good religion does with bad ones. So the one brief thing, it's important to bear in mind. My colleague from history, Michael Dennis, chasing me on this one And the one white man with the moral sanity in the United States to realize that chattel slavery should be violently overthrown was John Brown, who was deeply religiously motivated. So we pile anecdotes, but that was worth throwing in. But anyway, for me, like, I agree that naturalism just doesn't do enough. I mean, I can't escape the fact that I have what the perspective of naturalism or superstitious beliefs. I believe in free will. There's no way that works under naturalism. I believe in moral truth, and I'm what, in the technical terminology, they call a non-natural moral realist. So I find myself saying, I can't really fault the theists. I mean, they have silly superstitious beliefs, they really do, but so do I. So what am I to make of this? The problem I have, I guess this is for both of you. I mean, why not just go back and be a Platonist? I mean, I believe in a higher moral truth, and that's a silly and superstitious thing to do. I just don't understand why. This is what the theist seems to say to me, that the idea of a higher moral truth would be less silly if, in addition to believing in a higher moral truth, I posited the existence of a personal, infinite being who mandates that moral truth or something. And you just seem to come back up against the Euthyphro problem again. So I find myself in that stance. I mean, I really shouldn't pick. If William James said this, you shouldn't pick on the theist because you've got superstitious beliefs too, and it seems like I do. But the theist wants to tell me that my beliefs would be less silly if I posited this God. And there is where you said that meaning will come if I believe in this personal sort of entity. And if you could fill me in on that, it would be helpful, because I'm somewhere in the middle.
Wow, if I had an hour, I could unpack the whole way that meaning comes out of, moving out of the naturalistic box, I guess. But maybe I'll just say a couple of things, if I can. One is that the way out of the Euthyphro dilemma, I think, is to understand that what is good is inseparable from God because it is dictated by his character. So that is how we know something about God. If there is this seed planted in all of humanity that understands there is something that is just and good, a goodness, and we tend to agree even on some of the ways that might look, then it doesn't become a dilemma anymore, because the things that God declares are good, he couldn't have just randomly declared something good. It comes out of the character of God, and that's how we then know that God is a personal God with a character, and therefore becomes someone with whom we relate. But the other thing that I will say is it's not that theists posit God, it's theists respond to God positing himself. So there's this evidence lying around that we encounter and we discover. And when we encounter it and discover it, we have to make some sense of it. And I can only say to you that my understanding of things is that God has posited himself and has left evidence to discover him. And I discover him, and through things like morality and justice and so on, I know something of the character of God. And once you've gone so far as to say, I know something of the character of God, then actually it does give meaning and purpose to life, because you're no longer locked within this whole cycle of cause and effect. Things like free will do take on meaning. Idea of having a purpose to your life rather than just living your days until you die or decide to end it yourself. And I think we're seeing some of the impact of that in our culture at the moment with a generation coming through who don't have a sense of purpose. It has been actually taken out from society, and there's a sense of lostness there.
I'm just going to disagree with that. I mean, if you go back to the Platonic dialogues, I mean, you'll maybe in the Republic, I've forgotten, where you have a couple of old men sitting around saying, "In the good old days," that's a story that's been told for a long, long time. The Greeks had it with an idealization of a kind of classical period, and certainly the Christians have it as well. And with respect to, this idea that God put something in it, did he put it in the Neanderthals? Was there a particular period in the last 80,000 years when Homo sapiens came out of Africa that he put it? That just strikes me as myopic view without any sense of scale, without any sense of the sort of naturalistic properties that underwrite things like the ability to be altruistic, that underwrite the ability to have solidarity with others, that underwrite the ability to love other people. And of course, what goes alongside that are ugly things too. Bloodlust, violence. I suspect the Neanderthals didn't do well in part because we were pretty good at wiping them out. And that grotesque, violent Love of blood gets reflected politically in certain political struggles that we even saw break out in the 1990s in Europe. So it's a complicated story, but it strikes me that a lot of the springs of that story are best understood naturalistically, not by talking about God implanting something in beings at some particular moment of time.
I have one question for both of you. Don't worry, it's short. First of all, for Dr. Abela,
It's at Abela, just so you know. Yeah, okay.
Great speech. I love like you said, the true, the beautiful, the good, well put. And
well, Plato gets the credit for that, I think.
you mentioned that it's not that appealing that natural science is God. Why do you think that? Can you extend that a little bit?
Well, I have to do the whole presentation again. I mean, it's, to my mind, it's, as both Darwin and Huxley, the people closest to the birth of the theory gave, it's a grotesque slaughter machine where most of the small changes are deleterious to the living organisms in which they happen. Most of the things don't even get on stage. They don't even get out of the embryonic period. You know, I mean, if you rolled it, I mean, you've got the whole Darwinian story, which of course, you know, people like social Darwinists were willing to christen as survival of the fittest, and you get the Spencer language that creeps into, I think it's one of the later editions of The Origin, although Darwin himself didn't invent the term survival of the fittest. That was a social Darwinist view that, again, then took root in people like Huxley, in fact, tried to fight in the 1870s and in the 1880s, although not entirely successful, as the early 20th century evidenced. I'm sorry. Right. So if you're thinking about the uncomfortable character of natural selection, it seems to me that it's just written on the face of it. I think you could even ask a more primitive question, of course, which we don't do because we're just so, you know, attuned to the status quo. But maybe philosophers occasionally get a glimpse of what's mundane and can throw a spotlight on it. I mean, just the thought that, you know, creatures, allegedly created from an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving being, in order to survive, have to kill one another, eat one another, and digest one another. It's an absolutely peculiar, I mean, standing back from a moment, it's a very peculiar conception of a creature. And if there were an infinite number of ways in which God could have expressed his properties, that's a rather odd one. And I don't even know if you have to put the ugliness of natural selection on top of it.
For Dr. Can I? May I?
What? Last question.
Okay, one last question. So for Dr. Hannah Robbins, you explained your faith is to Christianity, and to my understanding, your belief is based on Scripture, and of course, Holy Spirit. So can I say that because the Scripture was written by people that is 30 years after the Lord's passed, can I say that I believe in those people? I believe in Paul, I believe in Peter and John Luke, rather than God? Or do I believe in God?
I'm not sure I understand your question. You mean from reading the Gospels, do you believe in the people who wrote the Gospels, or do you believe in God? Well, I don't believe that Jesus wrote any of the Gospels. Nobody ever claims that, to be honest. So, I mean, we're talking about people who were eyewitnesses of events, making a recording of what they saw, in a nutshell. Thank you.
The hour is late. I know there are additional people who would like to ask questions. I would suggest that you can capture our two speakers tonight in the foyer over refreshments in a moment. But before we head out to the foyer, I would like to thank both of this evening's speakers. I think the conversation has been rich, but certainly civil. I don't think Anna is at risk of losing her faith, and hopefully Paul is not at risk of losing his pants.